Good morning. Good morning, everyone. So welcome to my library. This morning I'm doing English 2 Fiction Pack. And this will be the document that helps you do the dissection on your short story that you choose for your fiction project / fiction exam. I've combined the two of them so you have an opportunity to show your expertise, kind of an open book form, through detailed responses and analysis. This document can be found for download and for viewing in all sorts of places, announcements, assignments, and also discussion board after this video is done. If you were there for the poetry exam, you have a copy in person, and if you missed the poetry exam, you should send me an email. Otherwise, you can also pick up hard copy at my house. We're doing drive-through document things. I don't know. You drive up and I'll hand you a pile of documents through your window. Anyways, here we go. Fiction pack. On the first page, what you're noticing is a plotline structure. So there are 3 components to this: exposition, body, and denouement. The denouement covers everything after the climax. Within the exposition in the first story, we're going to do a silent towns. You're going to notice that we're going to introduce character, setting, point of view, and the themes are introduced. This is when the tone is set, and this is when we get to know who our characters are and what their issues are. In the body of every short story, there's conflict, complication, and action. And let me remind you, there are 5 kinds of complications / conflicts that you need to know: man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, man versus technology, and man versus machine. In your fiction project, you will have to find 2 of each of the kinds. Denouement includes your crisis, your climax, and your resolution. So here is a visual representation of that plot structure. Notice, please, that there's always an inciting force or inciting incident that triggers change and creates the up and down movement of your rising action. Now, in Silent Towns, if I get real close, let's see if this works. You're going to notice that the second example has an up and a down, an up and a down, an up and a down. Now, the climax is the emotional high, but this series of up and downs, they matter because those are the difference in scenes. And so part of how you're going to show me that you are watching these videos is after every video, there will be an assignment / discussion board link that asks you specific questions. One of those questions for Silent Town is going to be, how many unique and individual scenes are there in the story? In other words, how many ups and downs make up the totality of the journey? Back page is blank. The next thing that you're going to see are glossary of terms. And just like I did with poetry, I'm going to list what you need to know. Most of these should already be highlighted, I think, because we have gone over the ideas of it. But if you have a highlighter, this would be a great chance to get it. Please highlight character. You need to know round, flat, dynamic, static, stock, and archetypal. Characterization, direct, and indirect. So characterization is how we tell a short story or how we tell a story in general. And there are 2 modes of presentation: direct presentation and indirect presentation. So direct presentation is when the author tells you what to think about the characters. For example, the female character is a bitch, period. We have to believe the author, but this is flawed, right? Because it's first person narration and I have no other input around it. Now, indirect would be if the author shows us how the character behaves and we come to the conclusion that she has an attitude problem. For example, the author shows us closing doors, the protagonist closing doors in other people's faces, and the author shows us that she talks snarkily to people and makes others cry, and the author shows us that she walks around with her nose in the air, and then the reader comes to the conclusion of what kind of character trait this person has. That's indirect, when the reader comes to the conclusion and is not told how to interpret it. Climax, the emotional high. I'm going to remind you there are two kinds of climaxes. One has a point like this. This is when the reader and the protagonist experience that emotional high at the same time. The second kind of climax is more like a mesa. It's a mountaintop. It's up, it's flat, and it's down. The first point would be the character's emotional high. The second point would be the reader's emotional high. Perhaps we find out about the climax after it's already happened. So our moment of emotional high isn't aligned with the protagonist. Next page. You need to know complication and conflict, the 5 kinds of conflict you're going to have to identify. Denouement. This is the resolution of the plot of the literary work. The denouement of Hamlet takes place after the catastrophe, with the stage littered with corpses. This is like not the end, but before the end. The time between the final battle and the cut scene. Okay. You need to know dialogue, diction. Now there are some authors that are very good with this bit of diction. Hemingway, he let his characters speak in their natural voice. Langston Hughes, another author that is very good at letting the characters, the personas, have attitude and have personality, and more importantly, have the intonation, the dialect, the dictation, and even the accents of their region, of their time, of their people. Kate Chopin with The Storm. They speak in a French Creole because they're from Louisiana, from Baton Rouge area. So they have a very strong dialect, and that is represented in the story. That's an example of diction. Dilemma. Dilemma. We are in a dilemma. A literary dilemma is when we have 2 choices and neither of them are good. Don't come to class, watch on video. Both of the choices suck. This is called a dilemma. Okay? Exposition. This is the very beginning of the story where we learn who the characters are and what their reality is. This is the status quo of the story, the background of the story. There's always a time marker that tells us something about where we are in timeline, history timeline, or their own life timeline. In the Silent Town, when we get to this story and you're reading it, I need you to be able to identify the beginning and end of the exposition, the exact moment of the inciting force that triggers change, and then, as we said, the very individualized scenes of the ups and downs. Those are your conflicts and your rising actions. You need to know falling action. Some stories don't let it fall to a resolution and denouement. Some stories keep it a cliffhanger, and that, of course, throws it back into a sequel. That's kind of like our lives. In about half an hour, my house will be awake, and that will be the trigger of change. The quiet will be gone, and then every time a new adventure starts, we're in this circular pattern. The rising action of baking the muffins, or the falling action of breaking the muffins, the rising action of the dog barking. Checking the door, no one's there. The falling action, okay, everybody's quiet again. Now we need to watch a movie, the rising action, then the movie ends, the falling action. This is repetitive and circular. You need to know figurative language, flashback. This is an interruption when the protagonist looks backward on their life or events. Foreshadowing. There are always images, words, and symbols that foreshadow the outcome. Okay, now sometimes, like in Silent Town, this is connotative, like it's a feeling or a gender, or it's a pro and a con, or a happy and a sad, but it influences how we perceive what's to come. This is foreshadowing. It's a good idea to get in the habit of finding the foreshadowing moments. You need to know imagery, and that is the point of Silent Town. Visual, auditory, olfactory, which is your scent or your sense of smell. Gustatory, which is sense of scent and sense of taste. Tactile, how something actually feels. This pillow is a little bit grainy. That's a tactile description. On the other hand, if I say that this phone is smooth and soft and feels like crystal, well, then that's also a tactile description, actually how it feels under somebody's fingertips. We have kinesthetic or kinetic. This is the way it moves, quickly, hastily. It's jumping around. This is actually physical movement. Organic. Now in short stories, organic imagery is very hard to come by. This is where the story naturally makes you laugh or cry. There are a couple of moments, if you're paying close attention to a reading, even in a short story, that will make you laugh. Maybe make you cry, at least internally. You're like, oh, that sucks. That's an organic reaction. Most organic reactions take place in longer pieces of fiction. You need to know thermal imagery. This is when there's notation about temperature specifically, heat and cold and shivering and icicles that really give you a sense of how cold or how hot something is. You need to know the inciting force. This is, of course, the trigger of change. And in Silent Town, there is a very specific trigger of change. In Chrysanthemums, very specific trigger of change. And in Hills Like White Elephants, the trigger of change came before the story. We don't actually know about it. You have to interpret and dissect a little bit to get to it. But every story has a trigger of change. Irony. There are 3 kinds of irony you need to know: verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is when you know something the characters don't know. The protagonist is like, oh, he's my friend, but that person already told the audience that they're a bad guy, either with words or action. So us, the reader, we're like, no, he's not your friend, he's a bad guy. But then the protagonist goes and gives him a hug anyways, and we're like, oh, don't do that. That's dramatic irony, when we know something that the audience doesn't, or the characters don't know. You need to know literal language. Now let's talk for a second about motif. Please circle it, put a star, put an arrow, highlight it. Motif doesn't happen without some work, okay? First, we have an image. We see the image once. No big deal. It's a book. You see a book. Okay, a book. No problem. That's an image. When that image takes on more meaning, becomes more significant, now we're seeing a book on a table, and we're seeing a book in a different room, and we see a book outside, and then it turns out to be that that book represents knowledge or power or enlightenment or ability. Now we're in symbol territory, right? Because the book is more than just a book. It means something because it keeps showing up, okay? The good book, the strong book, the powerful book, whatever it is, okay? The playbook. When we see these images show up over and over again through a whole entire work, then we begin to have motif, and motif might be something related to theme, the idea that from words comes wisdom. This would be a reoccurring motif. The book becomes a motif, but it doesn't become a motif without the work of the symbol and the image showing up over and over again in different contexts, accumulating meaning as it goes. You need to know the difference between narrator and author. Author is who wrote the story, narrator is who tells the story, and they're not the same thing, okay? You need to know plot. So there are 2 basic kinds of plot, and this goes back all the way to the very first day of class when we were talking about introductions, and I was telling you the plot structure of my life, right? There are 2 kinds of plot. The first is Stranger Comes to Town, and the second is Hero's Journey. Now, Stranger Comes to Town is a very specific kind of story. The protagonist is either the stranger or the town. A stranger comes into the town, or the town says, hi, stranger, come to us, okay? We have a stranger coming into an environment. And that stranger grows, changes, learns, evolves, makes friends, makes enemies, makes trouble, makes successes. At the end of the story arc, the stranger has a choice. They can leave or they can stay. They can become part of the fabric of their experience, or they can go and take their knowledge and return back to where they're from, or maybe go find a new town. Now, in our case, right, the very first day of school, we experienced a stranger comes to town moment. I walked into a class, I was a stranger, I walked into your collective group, and I shook things up. That's one way to read it. Or the second way to read it. I'm actually part of the institution. I represent COD. And in this case, all of you individually are strangers. You're coming into my town, my classroom. I set the rules, and you're going to change for the betterment or worse of the experience. Stranger comes to town. Now, the second kind of plot structure is called Hero's Journey. And Hero's Journey has these very specific components, right? There are 8 of them that you need to know. Exposition, inciting force, rising action, conflict, man versus man, self, nature, machine, society, and of course, climax, falling action, and resolution. These are the components of the plot structure. They're also the components of the hero's journey. The hero in the exposition, we always find out who they are, where they come from, what they need, what they like, what they don't like, what the problem is, right? We learn something about them. Now, right before that inciting force, the protagonist, main character, finds out that they're missing something, they're lacking something. Maybe they're lacking love, or maybe they're lacking excitement. Maybe they need a map. Maybe they want riches or power. Maybe they're trying to find self-fulfillment. Maybe they need safety. That epiphany, that realization that something is lacking, propels them into the inciting force, the ability to see, notice, or hear the call to action. Now, the call to action, that inciting force, Joseph Campbell calls it a threshold, like a door, right? We choose as protagonists to walk through it, but not always. Sometimes we're pushed over it, and sometimes we reject the call and we go in a different direction and a different story starts because we reject the call to action, which in and of itself is its own inciting force. Now, once we walk over to the threshold, we're in the rising action, and the rising action, metaphorically speaking, this is when we climb mountains, we go through valleys, we swim across oceans, we ride magic turtles, we meet fairy godmothers. There's divine intervention. We find a magical map or a cloak or a sword. It's when we learn and we face our monsters and our demons and our internal fears. It's when we start helping people and we learn that by helping others, we become more powerful. All of these things are related to the rising action.